Today on the newscast, Iran threatens America and demands that President Trump be put on trial over the death of Qasem Soleimani. Get all the breaking details next. Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. Happy New Year to everyone. I hope your 2022 is off to a great start. It has already been a very eventful year in the Middle East, and the Iranian regime is beginning 2022 the same way it left off 2021, with threats against the United States. But folks, you could say the threats that were levied today against the U.S. by Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi have really taken things to a new level. Remember, today, January 3rd, 2022, is the 2-year anniversary of the death of Iranian terror master Qasem Soleimani. Now, rewind 2 years ago, this very day, Soleimani and the leader of the popular mobilization units in Iraq, those Iranian-backed Shia militias, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, they were both killed at Baghdad International Airport shortly after landing by a U.S. drone strike. Now, today, the Iranian regime and its proxies across the region, across the world really, are commemorating Soleimani and mourning his death with events throughout Iran, throughout the Shia areas of Iraq as well. We had an event also in Gaza City, in Lebanon, run by Iran's most lethal proxy, Hezbollah, and I'm sure they are mourning Soleimani in Yemen as well, where the Houthis reside, that other Iranian proxy. Needless to say, this is a very big date on the Iranian calendar, and Raisi, the Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, who took office back in August, delivered a major televised speech today on Iranian state TV. And folks, he directly threatened the United States and in particular called for President Trump, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and other U.S. officials who were in office at the time of Soleimani's death, called for them to be put on trial. And Raisi said, unless former President Trump and these other U.S. officials are put on trial, then the United States will face revenge from, quote, the martyrs of the Muslim nation. Raisi said, revenge will come from the sleeve of the Muslim nation, and I quote. Now again, Raisi specifically mentioned former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, but he really zeroed in on President Trump, called him, quote, the main criminal behind the death of Qasem Soleimani, and called for him to be brought before a so-called fair court, whatever that means. President Trump and other U.S. officials, and also, of course, called for the UN to take action against the United States and again against President Trump. Needless to say, folks, President Trump will not be going to trial anytime soon over the death of Qasem Soleimani, but nevertheless, the Iranian regime is vowing revenge. More on what that could look like in a minute. But real quick, let's rewind to that fateful day 2 years ago and why President Trump ordered the hit on Qasem Soleimani. To put it bluntly, folks, he was the world's #1 terrorist. I say that without reservation. The second most important figure in the Iranian regime, next to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Soleimani, who was the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, he answered directly to the supreme leader. They had a very close relationship, and again, seen as the second most important figure in the entire regime, which is the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism, according to our own State Department here in the United States. Soleimani was in charge of the Iranian regime's external terror operations around the world, and in particular in the Middle East, where from Yemen to Gaza to Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, the Iranian regime has really set up shop and essentially controls these Arab countries. That's thanks largely to the infrastructure that Soleimani built, the terror infrastructure. He was also the architect of Iran's strategy of encircling Israel with that ring of fire, missiles and drones surrounding the Jewish state. And of course, Soleimani was the architect of countless terror attacks in Iraq that took the lives of countless U.S. soldiers. And at the time of his death, according to the Trump administration, Soleimani landed in Iraq to plot more attacks against U.S. personnel in that country with those Iraqi Shia militias that are backed by the Iranian regime. In many ways, he was an irreplaceable figure in the hierarchy of the Iranian regime. Just look at how they are mourning him still today. 2 years later, it is still very fresh for them, clearly, and they are still vowing revenge, even though, by the way, in the immediate aftermath of his death back on January 3rd, 2020, a few days later, I believe it was January 8th of that year, the Iranian regime launched several missiles at a base in Iraq that was housing U.S. troops. But apparently that was not enough, and the Iranian regime wants more blood in retaliation for Soleimani's killing. When I think of his death, the book of Proverbs, chapter 11, verse 10 comes to mind, which says, "When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy." There were not shouts of joy by President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris at the time, by the way. Both were vying for the Democrat nomination in January 2020, and both condemned President Trump for taking out Qasem Soleimani, as did Bernie Sanders and other leading Democrats here in the U.S., and other European diplomats, etc., also condemned President Trump and the United States over this action against Qasem Soleimani. But needless to say, I think it was a necessary action to help save lives. The Iranian regime clearly does not feel that way, and these threats against the U.S., these fresh threats, come against the backdrop, again, of these nuclear talks in Vienna. You have to wonder, is the Iranian regime, again, angling for leverage here with these new threats? The more Iran threatens killings or terror against the U.S., U.S. personnel in Iraq, around the world, threats against Israel, the more they are trying to push the United States into a corner. They're trying to bully the United States, essentially, and world powers in these nuclear talks in Vienna. It's a blackmail, extortion type scenario, folks. Drop the sanctions against us, says the Iranian regime, or we will do very bad things. Sadly, the Biden administration seems to be playing right into the Iranian regime's hands. In terms of striking against the U.S., the most obvious target would be U.S. personnel in Iraq. We still have some 2,500 U.S. soldiers stationed there. Their combat role recently ended in Iraq, but they are still there in an advisory position, and there is no firm withdrawal date for those 2,500 U.S. troops. So they are certainly a target of the Iranian regime and its proxies in Iraq. And lo and behold, earlier this morning, Monday, January 3rd, 2 explosive-packed drones targeted U.S. soldiers at Baghdad International Airport. Now, there are troops stationed in a wing of the airport. These explosive-packed drones were heading towards those troops. Thankfully, they were shot down by the CRAM defense system, according to a U.S.-led coalition spokesman. But on the wings of one of these drones were slogans about avenging Qasem Soleimani. One last thing to mention here as we're talking about the events surrounding the 2-year anniversary of the death of Qasem Soleimani. Yesterday, Sunday, January 2nd, the Iranian regime, or forces loyal to the Iranian regime, hacked into the Twitter accounts of 2 Israeli publications, the Jerusalem Post and Maariv. These are major mainstream Israeli newspapers, and a photo was posted on these Twitter accounts by these Iranian-linked hackers. Basically, the caption said, "We are closer than you think," and there was a picture of what appeared to be the hand of Qasem Soleimani dropping a ballistic missile on Israel's Dimona nuclear reactor, a serious threat to say the least. And it comes on the heels of these Iranian military exercises about 2 weeks ago, in which they simulated an attack, missile and drone attack, on Israel's lone nuclear reactor in Dimona. So folks, as the new year is upon us here, 2022, the Iranian regime is escalating its rhetoric and its threats against the United States and Israel. I've been saying for the past few weeks, fasten your seatbelts because 2022 seems like a year of acceleration. We will talk about this more all this week, of course, on the newscast, but Wednesday, January 5th, mark your calendars, we will have our first Watchman Newscast live stream of 2022 right here on the YouTube channel between 4 and 5 p.m. Eastern Time on January 5th. Be sure to join us. Bring your questions for our Q&A session. We'll be talking about all of these events in the world's most chaotic and pivotal region, the prophetic implications, and how it all affects you, no matter where you live. So don't miss it. Until tomorrow, God bless you. Thanks for joining us. And remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.